Tonight on Nation to Nation, a special report on Ontario foster care in crisis. Tammy Keeash drowned in a Thunder Bay floodway in May of 2017 while she was in care. Nation to Nation producer Ken Jackson reports on the foster home she had been living in.
There was lack of supervision, kids were drinking, one had to be hospitalized for severe intoxication, and another kid ended up in Winnipeg without staff even knowing that they were gone.
A Thunder Bay child welfare lawyer says children's aid societies often fail to tell parents their legal rights.
I've seen instances where families are involved with the child welfare system and their kids have been in care for years sometimes before triggering a lawyer.
And a young woman formerly in care isn't surprised by the systemic problems.
It's heartbreaking to say, but it really isn't surprising. The system is malfunctioning.
I'm Todd Lamourant, and welcome to Nation to Nation. There's no political panel tonight because what we're going to discuss should never be political. We're talking about a child's death, a life cut far too short. Here are some names and faces you may know. Kanina Sue Turtle, Amy Owen, Courtney Scott, and Tammy Keeash.
Okay, this is Stairway to Heaven.
14 girls who died within 6 months of each other in different parts of Ontario while in Child Protective Services. Nation Nation producer Kenneth Jackson has written extensively about Kanina and Amy, showing how their suicides were connected. Now Kenneth has new information on Tammy Keeash, about who knew what and when, about the foster home she was living in when her body was found in a Thunder Bay waterway, May 2017. Kenneth, you're in Thunder Bay right now. What have you uncovered?
2 months before Tammy's death, she was placed in a foster home here in Thunder Bay by Tikanagan Child and Family Services. Her death raised a lot of questions. Her body was found partially nude in a nearby waterway. In the end, her death was ruled an accidental drowning. But until now, information about the foster home she was living at has gone unreported. Documents found in the courthouse behind me show there was no less than 7 investigations into the company that operated 3 homes, including Tammy's, within a year of her death. Those allegations that were verified showed that there was lack of supervision, kids were drinking, one had to be hospitalized for severe intoxication, and another kid ended up in Winnipeg without staff even knowing that they were gone. But they also show that Tammy was supposed to be under 24-hour supervision. That means no one should leave her side. But the night she died, she was driven to meet family by a staff member from the foster home. The family and Tammy then went to a nearby park to drink, and she never left alive.
Now, Kenneth, you said earlier there were at least 7 investigations into the company a year before Tammy died. Who did the investigations?
They were done by Delico Nishnabek Family Care. It's an Indigenous child welfare agency here in Thunder Bay. They did the investigations because the authority to do so falls to them. They started in March 2016 and quickly removed all of their kids from the home. They then told the province about what was going on, and eventually told Tikanagan to do the same thing, but that never happened.
Ontario approved this home and issues the license to operate and inspects them. So what does the province have to say about all this?
Well, not a whole lot. They're not saying too much. Like, I know that they knew about what was going on. They were told that by Delico, and I know that during an annual review of the company's home, which is Johnson Children's Services, of their license, the province did a review of their license, and just about 2 months before Tammy's death, they were then giving up what's known as a provisional license, meaning that it had conditions, and those conditions included things like keeping daily logs in the home, something Delico had found they weren't doing as well. That helps them keep track of the kids. If they go missing, they can tell police they were last seen wearing this, their hair was this color, that sort of thing. But the province isn't saying much, but they are named as a party, as a defendant in this courthouse.
I know you said the documents come from the Thunder Bay courthouse, but what about the case?
Well, the case is actually very interesting. It involves Delico versus Tikanagan. For years, they've been arguing over jurisdiction. Now, Thunder Bay is Delico's jurisdiction, and they believe that when Tikanagan sends a child from Northern Ontario to live in Thunder Bay foster home, that the supervision aspect of it should fall to Deleco. That hasn't been happening, and they've been fighting over it. So Deleco went to court in July 2016 to file an emergency injunction to force their hand, also on the Ontario government. As I was saying, their name was a defendant. That was put aside into mediation, and when Tammy died, they filed another injunction to request the same thing. It's still unresolved and still in mediation.
Now, you've done a lot of work on deaths of First Nations children dying in protective services. It's highlighted failures in Ontario's child welfare system, largely confirmed by a special report by the coroner's office this past September. Do the people you speak with feel it hit the mark?
Well, you know what they say to me? They say, I've heard it all before. Now, the coroner, what he did was there was a lot of kids dying in child protective services between 2014 and 2017. He picked 12 of those kids. 8 of them had to be Indigenous, and 6 that were in the APTN Nation territory, which belongs to Tikanagan. That's on their jurisdiction. Now, what he did was he hired, he got a panel of experts together to review the documents for each death. They weren't able to ask questions. In the final report, you could see a lot of gaps because they would say this information didn't exist for this one kid, but they weren't able to ask any questions on it. So people were going, people worried that it didn't do enough. Like, yes, there was recommendations. Yes, they said do this, but we've all heard that before, and they heard it too. So no, they don't feel hit the mark, and particularly the families that I speak to, who, really feel that it didn't give them the answers that they wanted.
You, of course, reported on 14 stories on Kanina Sioux Turtle since February 28th. A reminder to viewers, Kanina was known to be chronically suicidal. She filmed her death in a Sioux Lookout foster home, which was owned and operated by Tikanagan. Kenneth, why hasn't there been a coroner's inquest into their deaths?
Well, I asked the coroner that when he was doing the expert panel review. I said, you're operating in the dark. No one can see what you're doing. I said, if you called an inquest into these deaths, which he has the power to do so, and it's only him, which is the chief coroner of Ontario, they have to call the inquest. I said, if you call an inquest, it's all in the public. Everyone gets to see it. And he told me, Ken, this will make it easier and faster. I can direct it the way it needs to go, and it doesn't involve lawyers and all that sort of thing. But the families just want answers. Like in Kanina's death, she was left alone in the foster home for 45 minutes the day she died. She was chronically suicidal. Everyone knew it. She was missing counselor appointments the day before leading up to her death. But the family's never been told why she was left alone. They had to go to court just recently and sue Tikanagan to try and find out.
Thank you for this update, Kenneth. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Todd.
After the break, we speak to a child welfare lawyer in Thunder Bay who fights the broken system, but also says that there's a way to fix it. Welcome back. Indigenous kids are dying in child welfare. At the end of the day, it's that simple. And as we've heard, their deaths aren't under the scrutiny of an inquest, despite each death showing how the system is broken. Our next guest knows this very well. He only takes child welfare cases. That means being paid legal aid rates. Marco Frangione isn't in this to get rich, but says his only goal is to help keep families together with their kids in Northern Ontario. Mr. Frangione, thank you. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thanks for having me. Good afternoon.
You're based in Thunder Bay, but you fly to remote First Nations in Northern Ontario 2 or 3 times a week. What is the biggest problem you see every day?
It'd be very hard to narrow down a specific problem. I would say there are a series of disconcerting problems with regard to how child welfare is administered in Northern Ontario. I would state, if I were to focus on 1 or 2 major issues that are affecting communities and families, at least from a legal perspective, it's children's aid societies that are accredited up north, not affording families legal advice, not affording them the opportunity to advocate for themselves, and really exploiting upon their vulnerabilities when they become involved in the lives of these families.
You just mentioned lawyers and legal aid. How many of your clients had a lawyer when their kids were taken and before you began representing them?
Very few of my clients have a lawyer at the onset of an apprehension. It's usually after considerable delay or hearing from members of the community or engaging other stakeholders in their communities that they actually have a right to obtain legal counsel. The law requires, whenever an agreement is signed or whenever the agency becomes involved in the lives of families, that they tell the families that it's their right, just like in a criminal matter, that they have a right to consult with counsel, and oftentimes that's not happening.
If a drunk driver gets arrested, they're entitled to a lawyer. I guess that what you're telling me is that it's not the same for parents?
What I'm saying is, up north, there's a very different reality on the ground than there is, let's say, in Southern Ontario. With our communities, and I'm speaking specifically with the communities on reserve, the fly-in communities that I often visit, the agencies will typically come into these communities if they feel they've identified a problem, take children away, have parents or caregivers sign a series of agreements, oftentimes not knowing what these agreements state, their ramifications, and often without affording them the opportunity to consult with a lawyer. It's usually after problems arise that the families realize that they have legal rights, call my office and ask to address these issues in court. I've seen instances where families are involved with the child welfare system and their kids have been in care for years sometimes before triggering a lawyer, which in itself poses many further problems.
What do you think should happen? A lawyer on hand 24 hours a day?
The way that the laws are written are fine. It's a matter of enforcing the laws that are already on the books. It is unfathomable to me that a court or the public at large can allow children's aid societies to sign agreements with families without a lawyer present, seemingly with impunity. There needs to be some sort of sanction in place to ensure that there is compliance with the laws that are already on the books. And until that happens, my fear is that a lot of these agencies will continue to repeat these behaviors moving forward.
As we know, Tammy Keeash had a customary care agreement. Does that mean her late mother could have just taken her home?
So the rules surrounding agreements are also well established under statute. Agreements require legal advice, irrespective of what you call the agreement. If it's a customary care agreement, a temporary care agreement, any agreement that's authored in writing by the Children's Aid Society requires some sort of legal advice. The legislation says a reasonable opportunity to be afforded legal advice. Once legal advice is provided, and let's just say in this instance, had a lawyer advised Tammy and said, revoke this, the agency that authored that agreement would have been obliged to take it to court right away.
Non-Indigenous viewers may think that child welfare agencies have a right to go into homes and take kids. But are they supposed to have a warrant before going into homes, and are they getting one?
Absolutely. It's a requirement that all children's aid societies obtain a warrant prior to apprehending children. The only way around that is if a child or children are facing something called imminent danger or imminent risk. That's what's written down legally in our jurisprudence. However, that is not what's practiced on the ground. The reality here, at least in Northern Ontario, is that the children's aid societies, all of them in my experience, based on an anonymous referral, sometimes they don't like the attitude of the parents, will apprehend without judicial oversight and remove children and scoop them away from their homes. That in itself is a flagrant abuse of process, and it's my hope that once more cases become scrutinized by the courts, that there will be sanctions made against the Children's Aid Society through cost orders and whatnot.
Lastly, on a personal note, why do you keep doing this? It certainly can't be for the money.
So I'm originally from Southern Ontario, and I moved to Timmins in at the end of 2013. I had no idea that this was something that I would be embarking upon. At first, I was just encouraged to take whichever files came my way, and I did. And it just so happened that my child welfare practice really took off. I became increasingly worried with a lot of the statutory abuses that I saw. I became very worried with a lot of the practices that I saw vis-a-vis the children's aid societies. And there was a common theme of civil liberties being trampled on and families being mistreated, including in the cultural sense, by these various agencies that were made to help promote family preservation and promote family bonds and promote family betterment. When I saw a lot of these injustices transpiring time and time again, I decided that I would use that as my motivation for my practice moving forward, and that brought me here to Thunder Bay, which is why I now have a practice where I fly to over 20 communities at a time.
Well, Mr. Frangione, I'm sure a lot of families thank you for doing this, and I want to thank you for speaking to me.
I appreciate your time. Thank you.
After the break, we talk to someone who was formerly in care. Welcome back. Nation to Nation producer Kenneth Jackson spoke with Ashley Dawn Bock. She was born into care far from her home community in Northern Ontario, and now advocates for youth and child welfare. Here's their conversation.
Ashley, thank you for joining us. Can you take us through your experience in foster care?
Yeah, so I was born into foster care in Vancouver. I went directly into a foster family at birth. I grew up in Langley, BC, so I was on the other side of the country from my community. I'm from Shiogomong First Nation, which is up in northwestern Ontario, and it was far, and there was no connection to my culture, community. I actually didn't even know my community's name until I was in my teen years. I think it was about 15 or 16 when I finally found out. And I had a lot of foster siblings. All my siblings are Indigenous. I was in the Indigenous stream in British Columbia, and had over 30 foster siblings, and most came in as babies or as toddlers and would stay for a few years and then either move to another family, maybe go back to their biological families or get adopted. And
What was it like growing up? You said you were Indigenous stream in BC, but it doesn't sound like there was a lot of cultural aspects in your home growing up. What was it like being disconnected from that?
Well, my family is non-Indigenous, and the ministry didn't seem to provide much support to them to understand things like racism and discrimination, what it really means to be First Nations youth. My family just wasn't equipped for that, and they didn't have the tools to connect me to my culture, and they didn't have that understanding or education either. And looking back, growing up, I didn't really understand what I was missing either, and I honestly didn't realize it until I was about 18, 19, and had left home, and then really realized that I had missed out on a lot in my childhood.
Now, you're from this area, into Thunder Bay, northwestern Ontario. You see the stories I write about young Indigenous girls dying in foster care, child protective services, taken from their families to protect them, but they're dying in a system that's supposed to keep them safe. What's it like for you when you see those stories like Tammy Keeash, Amy Owen, Kanana Sue Turtle? What do you think?
It's not surprising, and it's heartbreaking to say, but it really isn't surprising. The system is malfunctioning, or perhaps is functioning in the way that it was designed to, which isn't actually to take care of Indigenous youth. And it makes me think, like, what can be done? What can be different?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's what you're kind of doing now, right? You're working to make improvements. You're with the Anishinaabe Nation Youth Council, and you're also the president of
Youth in Care Canada.
Youth in Care Canada. Based on that work you're doing, what do you think can be done to help make change right now?
Immediately, the very first thing is all social workers, everyone that interacts with youth in care needs to take steps to limit the trauma and the instability that youth face, because those have a major effect on outcomes. And then second, the next thing is to, at least for Indigenous youth in care, improve connection to culture, improve abilities to come home if they want to, or to stay in their home communities. And those aren't easy things to do.
It sounds like, though, like that would be you know, the easiest thing for them to do, really, though, is let them stay home. You know, find if colonization, residential schools, you know, cause so much damage to these First Nations, the least the government could do is put some sort of system on each reserve that's severely damaged by child welfare. If that's addiction services, something like that. Those are, you know, things that they could probably maybe start doing now. And that's one of the things I want to talk to you about was the Chief Court of Ontario commissioned that report, a special panel report, where he got a bunch of experts to review the files of 12 dead kids between 2014 and 2017 in Ontario. 8 of them were Indigenous. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that report, because I think some people say it's been said before. And but I want to know from your experience in the system and trying to help now, what you think of that report.
Well, first off, yeah, there's 8 out of the 12 youth that, whose deaths were investigated, or they're Indigenous, and 6 of those Indigenous youth are from NAN communities, and that's really important to consider. There's a lot of remote flying communities up north, and it's true, a lot of these recommendations that come out, they've been said before, everyone knows them. The government or the ministry will commission another report, another study, come up with the same conclusions and say, we need to do this, we need to fix the system. But then nothing happens. And part of that is because when you address the need for systemic change, it's hard to pinpoint certain actors within that system, so certain people who can make decisions or who can implement something or who have direct contact with youth. It's hard to hold them accountable and identify them within a system.
What's your hope? You know, now see, in Ontario, we have the child welfare agencies are mandated through the province through provincial law, but they're on reserve. It's federal territory, so to speak, right? So you have 2 different governments, and they're both different sections of the spectrum, political spectrum, right? You have the Liberals, and you have the PC government on Doug Ford. What can they do? Can they, you know, what should they be doing right now to be trying to address this? Like, do you see them working together, or, you know, is that going to create more of a problem? Like, what can they do right now to start kind of moving this forward?
Well, first off, it was really disappointing to see the PC government's response to this report. I believe it was, I think it was the Minister of Health who stood up and addressed the findings and quite frankly didn't commit to doing anything about it. They just sort of acknowledged that this report had come out. So first off is immediate action, working with youth in and from care who know what they need. And then when it comes to jurisdiction, that makes it a lot harder, but it should be the First Nations that honestly should be in charge of this and should be addressing these things.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us. And I know you're busy here today doing a lot of good work.
Thank you.
So I really do appreciate taking the time.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Great. Back to you, Todd.
Thanks, Kenneth. And we learned earlier today that the first action by the Doug Ford government to reform child welfare in Ontario is to shut down the Office of the Child Advocate. It's a story we'll be following closely. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thank you for watching.